In the early 20th century, the Imperial Japanese Army embarked on a campaign of brutality and terror that shocked the world. From forced labor and suppression to murder, torture, and assault, the Japanese Imperial Army led a series of brutal conflicts and atrocities committed against civilians and prisoners of war, which have left a lasting impact on Asia and the world. These are the horrors of Japan's military campaign during World War II. There is no doubt that all sides in World War II were guilty of committing war crimes, ranging from minor offenses to very serious ones. However, the Japanese Imperial Army is noteworthy for the extreme and extensive nature of its crimes, inflicting unimaginable pain and suffering on an individual on a large scale. In the years prior to World War II, Japan had been in a war with China since 1931. When the Imperial Japanese Army invaded and occupied Manchuria, a region in northeastern China. The invasion was carried out in violation of the international treaties that Japan had signed and was a significant step towards Japan's militaristic and expansionist ambitions. The invasion was justified by the Japanese government as a response to a supposed attack on a section of the South Manchuria Railway owned by the Japanese, known as the Mukden Incident, a staged explosion that was used to justify the invasion. But evidence suggests that the attack was actually carried out by Japanese soldiers themselves. The Japanese Kwantung Army, which was stationed in Manchuria, launched an invasion and occupation of the region. Japan quickly took control of Manchuria and established a puppet state called Manchukuo, which was ruled by the last emperor of China, Puyi. The League of Nations responded by launching an investigation, and in February 1933, the League's report concluded that Japan had acted aggressively and violated China's sovereignty. In response, Japan decided to withdraw from the League of Nations, becoming the first major power to do so. Japan viewed the League's condemnation as unfair and biased against it, and to the League of Nations, it was a clear indication of Japan's growing desire to expand its empire in Asia. It was in 1937 when Japan would launch a full-scale invasion of China, following a small conflict between Chinese and Japanese troops outside Beijing. The war was fought in areas throughout China, with major battles taking in Shanghai, Nanking, Guangzhou, and Changsha, among others. And this is when Japan's brutality toward the civilian population would start to become more noticeable. Japanese officials and military leaders at the time held a view of racial superiority over the Chinese and other Asian peoples, which led to them viewing the Chinese people as subhuman and disposable for their plans. This belief was also influenced by prevailing scientific and racial theories of the time, which suggested that different races had different inherent traits and that some races were inherently superior or inferior to others, similar to Hitler's idea of the Aryan race. Naturally, this thinking by the Japanese military higher-ups would influence troops on the field, leading to brutal tactics employed by the Japanese army in China. Perhaps the most famous of which was the Nanking Massacre, also known as the Rape of Nanking, where Japanese troops committed horrific acts of violence, torture, rape, and murder against Chinese civilians, including women and children. It is estimated that the number of casualties ranged from at least 200,000 to possibly as many as 300,000. One eyewitness account was that of John Rabe, a German businessman who lived in Nanking during the Japanese occupation. In his diary and letters, Rabe detailed the atrocities committed by Japanese troops. Apparently, the atrocities were so brutal that he made efforts to protect Chinese civilians from Japanese violence, including using his Nazi party connections to pressure Japanese officials to create and respect the Nanking Safety Zone. Eventually, news about Japan's brutal treatment in China would not go unnoticed, and this was used by the Allies as propaganda to shape public perceptions of the war. Japanese soldiers were often depicted in Allied propaganda as fanatical and inhuman, highlighting Japanese stereotypes to portray the Japanese as cruel and barbaric. Accounts of Japanese soldiers executing Chinese civilians and other heinous acts were widely circulated in the Western press. As the war progressed, Japan's plans to expand its empire became more imminent. other Asian countries braced themselves for an attack. After China, Japan began invading the Philippines, Thailand, Malaya, now Malaysia and Singapore, Burma, now Myanmar, Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, French Indochina, now Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and setting up military bases in Guam, Wake Island, Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, Fiji, and New Caledonia during the period that we commonly know now as World War II. But it is worth noting that Japan also had areas colonized before, namely Korea and Taiwan. To achieve this, Japan employed a strategy called island hopping. The strategy involved bypassing heavily defended islands and instead capturing strategic locations first that were less fortified but still important to the Allied war effort. The Japanese began the island hopping strategy in the wake of their successful attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, which was highly successful in crippling the American naval presence in the Pacific, giving them a strategic advantage in the early years of the war. Japan then moved on to capture countries using a combination of swift and surprise attacks, highly similar to Germany's Blitzkrieg tactics in the West. Other factors, like the weakening of European colonial powers in Asia and the Japanese people's overwhelmingly high morale, also contributed to the initial success of their military operations. As with what happened in China, the Japanese committed atrocities on its new territories. Tens of thousands of women, mostly from Korea, China, and the Philippines, were forcibly taken by the Japanese military to serve as comfort women, sex slaves for Japanese soldiers during the war. Many of these women were raped and subjected to physical and psychological abuse. Another well-known atrocity by the Japanese was Unit 731, a covert biological and chemical warfare research and development unit of the Imperial Japanese Army, which conducted human experiments on prisoners, including the intentional infection of prisoners with diseases like anthrax, cholera, and the bubonic plague. It is estimated that thousands of people died as a result of these experiments. Many researchers involved in Unit 731 were never brought to justice for their actions. Many Japanese soldiers also participated in the indiscriminate killings of civilians. Allied soldiers also had to endure Japanese brutality, especially in the event that they were ever captured. The Japanese were known to be fierce and determined fighters who would often fight to the death rather than surrender. This was due in part to their military training and belief in the Bushido Code, which emphasizes a never-surrender mentality, as well as their cultural values of honor and loyalty. Additionally, the Japanese military had a reputation for using unconventional tactics, such as ambushes, suicide charges called banzai charges, and faking surrenders to get closer to the enemy before attacking, which made it difficult for Allied soldiers to anticipate their movements and actions. Another example was the use of kamikaze attacks, in which Japanese pilots would deliberately crash their planes into Allied ships, which also contributed to the fear and uncertainty surrounding the Japanese soldiers' way of thinking. Furthermore, the Japanese were also known to be particularly brutal towards prisoners of war. One famous event was that of the Bataan Death March, where approximately 75,000 American and Filipino soldiers were forced to march more than 65 miles from Bataan to a prison camp. And during the march, prisoners were subjected to beatings, shootings, and bayonet stabbings, and many were denied food, water, and medical care. It is estimated that up to 10,000 prisoners died during that march. There were also reports of Japanese soldiers resorting to cannibalism and enemy soldiers. The Japanese army would not only be brutal to the people in the countries they invaded, but also to their own people, especially those who were suspected of disloyalty. The Kempeitai in particular was the military force of the Imperial Japanese Army, and it was feared by the Japanese people due to their brutal tactics and reputation for cruelty. The Kempeitai was responsible for maintaining internal security in Japan and occupied territories during World War II. They were known for their use of torture, intimidation, and summary executions in a bid to maintain order. Japanese citizens were often afraid to speak out against the government or military for fear of being arrested and tortured by the Kempeitai. The Kempeitai's actions were not only brutal toward civilians, but also toward Japanese soldiers who were suspected of disloyalty and cowardice. While there is absolutely no doubt that both Allied and Axis powers committed atrocities during World War II, the Japanese Imperial Army is often considered to have been worse than the others, due to the extreme brutality and atrocities committed by the Japanese military towards civilians, prisoners of war, and even their own soldiers and people. The Japanese army had a particular mindset and culture that made them more likely to engage in brutal and inhumane behavior, such as a belief in racial superiority and a strict code of honor that could justify extreme violence. Adding to this, the Japanese soldier would experience severe punishment for any perceived failure or weakness and is indoctrinated to believe that suicide is an honorable way to die, which would have affected their willingness to carry out acts of extreme violence as they had nothing to lose. However, people have their own way of measuring brutality and cruelty, and while certain groups may rank higher than others according to a particular measure, war is certainly equally brutal for all. After Japan's bitter defeat in 1945, the Allied powers held several war crimes trials in Tokyo and other cities in the Asia-Pacific region to hold Japanese officials and military leaders accountable for their actions during the war. The Tokyo trials prosecuted high-ranking military and political leaders for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Among those who were prosecuted were former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and several other members of the wartime government and military. In addition to the Tokyo trials, other trials were held in countries such as the Philippines and Indonesia to prosecute lower-ranking Japanese officials and soldiers for their roles in war crimes and atrocities. Today, several memorials are built in Asia and all around the world to remember World War II. These memorials serve as a reminder that war is a reflection of humanity's capacity for violence and destruction. And while it is important to look at the past, it is our responsibility to learn from it. Thank you so much for watching. See you in the next video.